John Parker sat alone in his old, creaky armchair by the window, gazing out at the neighborhood he had watched change for decades. The trees in his front yard had grown taller, the houses across the street had been remodeled, and yet everything around him seemed so different now. The house, once bustling with life, was now eerily quiet. He could almost hear the laughter of his children echoing through the halls, but that was years ago. Now the house was just a shell of its former self. His children, grown and busy with their own families, rarely visited anymore. It had been months since he'd seen any of them, and when they did call, the conversations were brief, filled with polite pleasantries but lacking any real connection. John's wife, Anne, had passed away a few years ago, and the void left by her death was still painful. He often found himself reaching for her side of the bed at night, only to be reminded that she was gone. The silence in the house had become deafening. Over the past few weeks, John had been feeling more and more tired. The ache in his bones seemed to deepen, and he found it harder to get out of bed in the mornings. His mind wandered back to his younger years when he was the proud father of 3 children. Mark, the eldest, Emily, the middle child, and Sarah, the youngest. He had worked hard to give them everything he thought they needed: good schools, a safe home, and all the love he could offer. Yet now, it seemed all of that had faded into the background of their busy lives. John sighed, picking up his phone. It was a habit now to check it, though he knew it was unlikely there would be any messages. Still, he hoped for a text, a call, anything from his children. His finger hovered over the contact names, and for a moment, he thought about sending a message to Mark, his eldest son. "Just checking in, Mark. I've been feeling a little under the weather. Hope you're doing well." He hesitated, then deleted the text. No one wanted to hear complaints from an old man. He put the phone back down on the table. His thoughts drifted to a time when his children were young, when they had all sat around the dinner table together, laughing and sharing stories of their day. Those were the days he cherished most, but they seemed so far away now. In the distance, the faint sound of children playing in a neighbor's yard reached his ears, and for a moment, he wished he could be part of that world again. But no, he was left in this quiet house, surrounded by memories of better times. John's mind wandered back to the days when he was needed, when he had been a constant presence in his children's lives, their protector and guide. He remembered all the sacrifices he made for their futures, the late nights working overtime, the weekends spent running errands, and the countless hours spent listening to their problems. Now, all he wanted was a visit, a phone call, or a simple "I love you" from one of them. Was that too much to ask for? He didn't know anymore. He had tried reaching out, but the responses were sparse, and the distance between them had only grown. The ache in his chest deepened as he realized how much he missed his family. John glanced out the window again, watching as the sun began to set. He wasn't sure how much time he had left, but he knew he had to do something. This emptiness, this loneliness was becoming unbearable. Perhaps it was time to reach out once again, but this time he wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Would his children even come? Would they care? He picked up the phone once more, scrolling to the group chat with his children. Slowly he typed, "I've been thinking a lot lately. I'm not feeling great. Just wanted to check in with you all. Hope you're doing well." He stared at the message for a long time, his finger hovering over the send button. Then, with a heavy sigh, he hit send. The days that followed were much like the ones before. John went through his routine, sitting by the window, reading the same newspapers, and occasionally glancing at his phone. But no messages came. No calls. No responses. His phone sat in silence on the kitchen counter, the weight of its emptiness growing heavier with each passing day. John had grown accustomed to the silence, yet it still stung. He tried not to dwell on it, but it was hard. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he would stand at the window, staring at the world outside, wondering where his children were, what they were doing, and why they couldn't make time for him. He often found himself recalling memories of their childhood, when he was the center of their world. He remembered Mark with his boundless energy, always asking questions about everything. John's work, the garden, the birds that flew past their house. Emily, with her quiet nature, would curl up beside him on the couch, seeking comfort in the simple act of being close. And little Sarah, with her constant chatter and curious eyes, would always demand his attention, climbing into his lap and asking for stories. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago. Time had a way of slipping through his fingers, like grains of sand, leaving behind only the faintest traces of what had once been. John stood up from his chair and moved to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, but there was nothing he particularly wanted to eat. His appetite had dwindled over the past few months, and he could feel the effects of not taking care of himself properly. His bones ached, his back was stiff, and his breathing had become more labored with every step he took. Yet, none of that seemed to matter to anyone. Mark had called him a few weeks ago, but the conversation had been short. Mark had mentioned how busy he was with work and his family. "I'm sure you understand, Dad. You know how things are," he'd said before quickly ending the call. John had understood, of course, but it didn't make it any easier. Emily had sent a text, but it was nothing more than a quick, "Hope you're doing well, Dad. Love you." The love felt distant, as if it was a formality, not a genuine expression of concern. And Sarah? She hadn't called at all. John tried to convince himself that they were just busy with their own lives, that it wasn't personal, that they hadn't meant to hurt him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his children were slipping away from him. The house, once filled with their laughter and footsteps, now felt like an empty shell, a silent reminder of how much things had changed. He thought about reaching out again. Maybe he could call Mark, tell him about his worsening health, maybe even mention how lonely he felt. But something stopped him. What if it was too much? What if Mark thought he was being needy or burdensome? What if his children had grown tired of him and his problems? John's chest tightened at the thought. He wasn't ready to face the possibility that his children might no longer want to be a part of his life. The feeling of rejection was a weight he didn't know how to carry. That night, as John lay in bed, he stared up at the ceiling, the quiet of the house pressing in on him. He thought about and how she had always been the one to hold the family together, to keep everyone close. She had passed away so suddenly, and John had tried his best to fill the void she left behind. But no matter how hard he tried, it was never enough. His children had their own families now, their own priorities, and the bond they once had with him seemed to be slowly eroding. He closed his eyes, feeling a sense of deep sadness wash over him. "Why does it feel like I've lost them?" he whispered to the darkness. John drifted off to sleep, but the feeling of abandonment lingered, a constant companion in the quiet hours of the night. It was another ordinary morning, and John was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee cup. He hadn't been sleeping well for the past few weeks, and his health was starting to show the signs. His hands trembled slightly as he brought the mug to his lips, the familiar taste of coffee doing little to wake him from the fog of exhaustion. The weight of his body felt heavier every day, as if it was harder to lift himself from his chair, harder to breathe, harder to move. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. For a moment, he thought it might be one of his children, but when he glanced at the screen, his heart sank. It was the hospital. "Mr. Parker, this is Dr. Stevens. We need you to come in for a checkup. It's important." The doctor's voice was calm but firm, and John could sense the urgency in it. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't bring himself to worry about it too much. After all, it was just another appointment, another reminder that his body was no longer what it once was. He made the call to arrange transportation, as driving had become increasingly difficult for him. The trip to the hospital felt like a small journey, but with every step he took, the reality of his situation hit him harder. His body, which had once been strong and capable, now felt fragile, as if he were simply waiting for the inevitable to happen. When he arrived at the hospital, the doctors ran a series of tests. The results were troubling. John's heart wasn't functioning as it should, and his lungs were weaker than they should be for a man his age. The doctor explained that his condition wasn't immediately life-threatening but warned that it would require ongoing treatment and lifestyle changes. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and John felt his chest tighten. The realization that his health was no longer something he could ignore left him feeling helpless. The doctor told him to rest and follow the prescribed treatment, but all John could think about was the emptiness of his life. He didn't want to be a burden to anyone, least of all his children. The thought of them worrying about him was unbearable. He sent a quick message to Mark, his eldest son, updating him about the doctor's visit. "Just wanted to let you know I had a checkup. The doctor says I need to rest. Don't worry about me." As he hit send, he felt a pang of loneliness in his chest. He hadn't heard from Mark in weeks, and the brief exchange felt hollow. He wasn't sure if Mark would even respond, but he couldn't bring himself to call and ask for more. The silence was deafening. Later that evening, John sat on the couch, flipping through an old photo album. He paused on a picture of his children, Mark, Emily, and Sarah, sitting on his lap, their faces filled with joy. They had been so young, so full of life. He had been their hero back then, the person they turned to for comfort, for guidance, for love. But now, all that seemed like a distant memory. His children had their own families, their own lives, and he was just a forgotten figure in their rearview mirrors. John felt a rush of anger and frustration building inside him. Why had they become so distant? Why had they stopped visiting? It was as if he had become invisible to them, and the realization stung more than he could put into words. He had given everything to them. His time, his energy, his love, and yet it felt like it was never enough. In that moment, something inside John shifted. He realized that he couldn't keep waiting for his children to come back to him. He had to stop relying on them for his happiness. He had been holding on to a version of his life that no longer existed, and it was time to let go. It wasn't easy to admit, but John knew he had to change his perspective. He stood up, feeling a surge of determination coursing through him. He wasn't going to spend the rest of his days waiting for something that might never come. His health might be declining, but that didn't mean he had to give up on living. He could still find joy, still find meaning, even if it wasn't going to come from his children. For the first time in months, John felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him the strength to move forward. He wasn't going to let the emptiness of his home consume him any longer. He was going to find a way to fill it with something else. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he was ready to figure it out. The following days passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and quiet reflection. John had taken the doctor's advice to heart. He knew he needed to rest more, but he also realized that simply existing in his home wasn't enough. His mind needed stimulation, and his spirit needed healing. He had been avoiding it for months, but that morning, something urged him to get up and walk around the neighborhood. The fresh air would do him good, he thought. Maybe it would clear his mind. So, he grabbed his coat and slowly made his way to the door. The cold hit him as he stepped outside, but it was a refreshing kind of cold, the kind that felt alive. As he strolled down the sidewalk, John found himself marveling at the changes in the neighborhood. New families had moved in, and the faces around him were unfamiliar. It struck him how life continued moving forward, even when it felt like time had come to a halt for him. People were busy, children ran by him laughing, and couples walked hand in hand, unaware of the weight of loneliness that hung so heavy on his heart. After a few blocks, John found himself in front of the local library. It had always been a place of comfort for him, a place where he'd go to lose himself in books when life became overwhelming. For a moment he stood there, just staring at the entrance. His legs ached, his body begged him to rest, but something inside urged him to go in. So he did. Inside, the familiar smell of books and the soft murmur of quiet voices greeted him. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where time slowed down and the chaos of the outside world could be forgotten. John wandered through the aisles. his hand brushing over the spines of books he had read years ago. There was comfort in the familiarity, but there was also a pang of sadness. He hadn't picked up a book in ages. As he continued to walk, he stopped in front of the section on history. He had always loved history. There was something about the past that fascinated him. He grabbed a book on World War II and walked to one of the reading tables. He sat down slowly, feeling his body protest, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of excitement. John spent the next few hours at the library, reading and learning, losing himself in the stories of history and human resilience. As he read about people who had survived unimaginable hardships, he couldn't help but draw parallels to his own life. He had his own battles to face, his own struggles with loneliness, but if people in the past could endure such difficulties, perhaps he could too. The idea of sitting in his house, waiting for his children to reach out, suddenly seemed so passive. He couldn't change the past, but he could control how he spent the present. The knowledge that his children had their own lives was painful, but it also opened up a new possibility. Maybe it was time for him to create new memories, to find meaning and connection outside of his family. When John left the library that afternoon, he felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. He walked back to his house, but this time he didn't feel quite so alone. He had a renewed sense of purpose, a small but significant spark of hope that maybe he could still find joy and fulfillment in life, even if it wasn't the way he had once imagined. The next few days, John started to take small steps. He began going to the library regularly, immersing himself in books and learning. He also started going for walks, not just around the block but farther, exploring parts of the town he had never bothered to visit before. He began attending community events, though he often felt like an outsider. But slowly, he started to form new connections, meeting people his age who were also looking for meaning and companionship. One evening, John decided to join a local volunteer group at the community center. It was a small group, mostly retirees, working on various projects to improve the neighborhood. He hesitated at first, unsure if he would be accepted, but when he walked in, he was greeted with smiles and handshakes. They welcomed him with open arms, and John felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: appreciation. For the first time in months, John found himself looking forward to the next day. His health was still an issue, but it no longer consumed him. He was discovering new parts of himself, rediscovering old passions, and even building new friendships. There was still pain from his children's distance, but it was no longer the only thing in his life. He was starting to build a life on his own, one that was slowly but surely filling the void. As he sat in his armchair that evening, reflecting on the changes he had made, John smiled. It wasn't the life he had expected, but it was a life nonetheless. And for the first time in a long while, he felt grateful. Weeks had passed since John's life began its subtle transformation. He had come to embrace the new rhythms of his days: morning walks, library visits, and volunteering at the community center. He had even made a few new friends. While the loneliness still crept in at times, John found himself feeling more at peace than he had in years. The ache of his children's absence was still there, but he no longer felt defined by it. He had discovered the quiet strength that lay within him, a strength he had long forgotten. One evening, after finishing his dinner, John sat in his favorite armchair by the window. The evening sun cast a soft glow over the neighborhood, and he couldn't help but smile. Life, as strange and unpredictable as it had become, still held beauty. As he sipped his tea, his phone rang, breaking his peaceful moment. John picked it up, unsure who would be calling him at this hour. When he saw the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was Mark, his eldest son. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. It had been so long since their last conversation. Was this just a courtesy call? Was he calling out of obligation, or was there something more? With a sigh, John answered the phone, his voice tentative. "Hello, Dad, it's Mark," came the familiar voice, sounding warmer than it had in their last exchange. I've been meaning to call. I know it's been a while and, well, I've been thinking a lot about you lately. John's chest tightened. There was a vulnerability in Mark's voice that John hadn't heard before. For a moment he couldn't speak, unsure of how to respond. It felt surreal to hear Mark's voice again, to hear the boy he had once raised speak to him with such honesty. I'm doing okay, Mark, John finally managed to say. Just been keeping busy. I'm getting by. I know you've been keeping to yourself, and I understand why. I've been caught up with work and my own life. But that's no excuse for not checking in on you, Dad. I'm sorry for not being there. The words felt like a balm to John's heart. The weight of years of silence began to lift, bit by bit, as he listened to his son speak with genuine regret. He had never thought Mark would apologize, and hearing it now felt almost too much to bear. I've been thinking about all the times I should have called, should have done more. But I didn't, and I'm sorry for that, Mark continued. I know I can't make up for lost time, but I want to change that. I want to be there for you. John swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say, but all that came out was a simple, "I've missed you, Mark." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mark's voice softened. "I've missed you too, Dad. I've been selfish. And I want to make it right. I'd like to come by this weekend, if that's okay with you." John felt a wave of relief wash over him, the words feeling almost surreal. His son was coming home. It had been years since they had spent any real time together, and the thought of reconnecting filled him with both hope and fear. Hope because this might be the start of rebuilding their relationship. Fear because he didn't know if they could ever truly go back to what they once had. But John knew he had to try. He couldn't keep holding on to the past, and he certainly couldn't shut his son out now that he was reaching out. "I'd like that, Mark. I really would," John replied, his voice steady now. "I'll see you then, Dad. I promise things are going to be different." The call ended, leaving John sitting in silence, his mind racing. What did this mean? Was this the beginning of a new chapter? Or would things go back to the way they had been? There were so many unanswered questions, but for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of excitement, a sense of possibility. As he sat there, looking out at the twilight sky, John couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to come full circle. The emptiness in his life wasn't gone, but there was now room for hope. A hope that perhaps in time, his relationship with his children could be healed. The days leading up to Mark's visit felt like an eternity. John couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. He had replayed every word in his mind, trying to find some hidden meaning, some assurance that things wouldn't go back to the way they were. His heart was full of hope, but it was also guarded, cautious. He had been hurt too many times to simply forget the past and throw himself into something that might shatter again. Despite the swirling doubts in his mind, John prepared his home. He dusted off the living room, rearranged the furniture, and even took down the old family pictures that had gathered dust on the shelves. Felt strange, but it also felt right. He was doing this for the possibility of something new. A new chapter in a story that had felt unfinished for so long. When the doorbell finally rang on Saturday afternoon, John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he had certainly imagined this moment 1,000 times in the past. Slowly he walked to the door, his hands slightly trembling as he reached for the handle. He opened it to find Mark standing there, looking almost exactly the same as he had all those years ago. There were some gray streaks in his hair now, and the youthful glow had been replaced by the weariness of adulthood, but it was still Mark, the son he had raised, the son who had left him without a word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, filled with unspoken emotions, memories, and regrets. Finally, Mark broke it. "Hey, Dad," Mark said softly. His voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and warmth. "Mark," John replied, his voice thick. He stepped aside to let his son in, his heart racing with anticipation. As Mark walked past him, John caught a faint smell of cologne, something familiar but distant. He almost didn't recognize it. Was this really his son? They both settled down in the living room, the tension between them palpable. John offered him tea, and they sat in silence for a few moments before Mark spoke again. I don't really know where to start, Mark began, his voice faltering. I guess I should start by saying I'm sorry, Dad. I've been a terrible son. I should have reached out to you a long time ago. I shouldn't have let it get this far. John felt a lump form in his throat. There it was again. Mark's sincerity, the apology he had never expected to hear. He had heard the words in his dreams, but hearing them in real life felt different. It was bittersweet, like a wound that had just begun to heal but still carried the scar of the past. It's okay, Mark, John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I understand. I don't want to live in the past anymore. I don't want to feel like I've been forgotten. I've missed you. Mark looked down. His eyes briefly filled with regret before he met his father's gaze again. I never meant to make you feel that way. I guess I was just caught up in my own life, and it was easier to pretend everything was fine than to face what I'd done. I've missed you too, Dad. I really have. John nodded, taking a deep breath. The silence that followed wasn't awkward but filled with a sense of understanding. Both father and son had endured years of pain and distance, but now they were sitting together, acknowledging the past, and opening the door to the future. Mark reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I brought something for you, he said, his voice more composed now. John raised an eyebrow, curious. What's this? Mark handed him the envelope, and John opened it carefully. Inside was a small card and a check. John's heart skipped when he saw the amount written on it. It was a substantial sum, more money than he had seen in a long time. I know it's not enough, but I wanted to help, Mark said. I know I've been distant, and I want to make it right. I want to be here for you. Not just as a son but as a friend. As someone who cares about you. John looked at the check and then back at his son. He was touched more than he could express. But as he looked at Mark, he realized that it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the gesture. The fact that Mark was willing to try, willing to take the first step toward rebuilding their relationship, meant more than any material gift. You don't have to do this, Mark, John said, his voice shaking. I never needed money. I needed you. Mark nodded, understanding the depth of his father's words. I know, Dad. I've been an idiot for not realizing that sooner. Sorry. But I'm here now. And I want to be a part of your life again. The moment felt fragile, like a delicate thread that could break at any second. But it also felt real. For the first time in years, John felt like he wasn't alone in the world. His son had come back, and together, they could begin to rebuild what had been broken. As they talked late into the evening, sharing stories, laughing and catching up on lost time, John realized that this moment, this rekindled bond, was everything he had been waiting for. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It was a step forward, and that was all he could ask for. It had been weeks since Mark's visit, and things had slowly begun to change in John's life. The once distant relationship with his son was now a work in progress, but it was something that felt right, something worth investing in. Mark had continued to reach out, sending texts, making calls, and even visiting when he could. They hadn't yet found a way to erase the years of silence, but they were building new memories, and that, John realized, was enough. One Sunday morning, as John sat on his porch enjoying a hot cup of coffee, he reflected on the changes that had occurred in his life. He had always thought that his children's absence was a permanent wound, one that would never heal. But as he sipped his coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up, he realized something profound. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the pain and finding new ways to grow, even in the face of it. His phone buzzed and he picked it up, surprised to see a message from Sarah, his daughter, who he hadn't heard from in months. His heart pounded in his chest as he opened it. Hey Dad, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I'm sorry for everything. I know we've had our differences, but I want to try again. Can we talk? John stared at the message for a long moment. It was a simple message, but the weight of it was immense. He hadn't expected Sarah to reach out, not after everything that had happened. There had been so many unresolved issues between them, so much pain and so many years of silence. But now she was asking to talk, asking for a chance. He felt a mixture of emotions, hope, fear, and uncertainty. Would this lead to another broken promise? Or was it a genuine desire for reconciliation? He didn't know. But one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this. This was his daughter reaching out. This was his chance to heal not just with Mark, but with Sarah too. After a deep breath, John typed a reply. "I'd like that, Sarah. When can we talk?" He hit send and immediately felt the weight of his decision. There was no going back now. He had opened the door, and it was up to them both to step through it. Later that afternoon, Sarah called. Her voice, though slightly hesitant, was tinged with the same warmth that John remembered from their earlier years. "Hey, Dad," Sarah said softly. "I didn't know how to start this conversation. I don't even know what to say to make up for all the years we've lost. But I've been thinking a lot about everything and I know I messed up. I just want to know if you're willing to give me another chance." John felt a tightness in his chest. Hearing Sarah's voice after all this time stirred so many emotions, but more than anything, he felt a deep longing for the connection they had once shared. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what to say either. The pain of those years of being left alone. It hurt more than I can put into words. But I've had time to think. Time to realize that holding on to that pain isn't helping anyone. I like to try again too. I'd like to see if we can rebuild what we lost." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, John wasn't sure if she was still there. But then Sarah spoke, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I've been dealing with my own issues and I've let them get in the way of our relationship. But I don't want to keep going down that road. I want to be there for you. I want us to have a chance." John closed his eyes, listening to his daughter's words. He had always known she had a good heart, but hearing her express her regrets made him realize just how much she had grown. It wasn't just about her apologizing. It was about both of them acknowledging the pain and moving forward together. "I think we both have a lot to make up for," John said, his voice filled with both hope and understanding. "But we can start slow. No pressure, no expectations. Just one step at a time." They talked for hours that day, catching up on lost time, sharing their fears and hopes for the future. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he was not only reconnecting with his children but also with the person he had once been, a father who loved his family fiercely, even through the heartache. As the weeks passed, John and Sarah continued to talk more often, slowly rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was progress. And for the first time in years, John felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't just the contact with Mark or Sarah that had changed him. It was his own journey of healing. He had learned to forgive, not just his children but himself. He had realized that life didn't always go according to plan, but that didn't mean it was over. There was still time to rebuild, to reconnect, and to find new meaning in the chapters that were still left to be written. John no longer feared the future. He embraced it, knowing that the path to healing was long, but that it was worth every step. The seasons had changed since Sarah reached out, and so had John's life. What had begun as a painful journey of loss and abandonment was slowly transforming into something new. A new chapter filled with the possibility of connection, healing, and the restoration of what had once seemed irreparably broken. John's relationship with Mark had continued to flourish. They spent more time together, shared stories, and for the first time in years they laughed like they used to. The tension that had once existed between them was slowly dissolving, replaced by a genuine desire to understand each other better, to make up for lost time. With Sarah, things were progressing as well. Their conversations had become more frequent, and though they still faced awkward silences and moments of uncertainty, there was an undeniable sense of progress. Sarah had started visiting more often, and John could feel the warmth of her presence in his home once again. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, John sat outside on his porch, reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions that had filled his life over the past months. His children, his precious children, were coming back to him. The wounds of the past were still there, but they no longer controlled his every thought. There was a new kind of peace settling over him, a peace that had seemed so distant just a few months ago. As he sipped his tea, he thought about all the things he had learned during this journey. The pain of abandonment had not disappeared, but it had softened. He had learned the value of forgiveness, not just for his children but for himself. He had spent so many years blaming himself, believing that his mistakes had led to their distance. But now he saw that healing was not just about accepting apologies. It was about recognizing that everyone had their struggles, their fears, and their mistakes. What mattered most was the willingness to try again. It wasn't easy, though. There were moments when John felt the weight of the past pressing on him, when memories of old arguments, harsh words, and missed opportunities resurfaced. But in those moments, he reminded himself that reconciliation was a process, not a destination. It was okay to take things one day at a time, to give himself and his children the grace to grow. That evening, Mark came over for dinner. It was one of those simple, ordinary moments that John had once longed for, sitting around the table with his son, enjoying a meal and talking about life. No pressure, no expectations, just a father and his son, sharing time together. As they ate, Mark looked at John, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how we were, how we are now. I know things have been rough, but I just want you to know, I'm really grateful for this. For you. For second chances." John smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm grateful too, Mark. I've learned a lot these past few months. I used to think it was too late to fix things, but now I see that it's never too late. We're still here. That's what matters." Mark nodded, his eyes a little misty. "Yeah, it's never too late. I've missed you, Dad. I don't ever want to lose you again." John reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, he knew that their bond, though scarred, was still strong. It was healing bit by bit, as they both chose to fight for it. Later that week, Sarah came over as well, and the family sat together in the living room. The air was filled with the sound of their laughter, a sound John had longed to hear again. They talked about old memories, their hopes for the future, and the things they had learned along the way. There were still difficult conversations to be had, still healing to be done, but in that moment, John felt a sense of completeness he had not felt in years. At one point, Sarah turned to him with a shy smile. "Dad, I've been thinking about something. I want to take you out for a trip. Just the two of us. Somewhere quiet where we can really talk, no distractions. What do you think?" John looked at her, surprised but touched by the offer. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. Where do you want to go?" "Somewhere simple," she said. "Maybe a little cabin by the lake. Just us, getting back to the things that matter." John smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't about grand gestures or lavish vacations. It was about the simple things, the moments that allowed them to reconnect, to heal, and to grow closer again. As they made plans for the trip, John felt a deep sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. Life had taken unexpected turns, and there were still many unknowns ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face the future, not alone but with his children by his side. The healing journey was far from over, but John knew that, with time, they would rebuild. The past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They had the power to shape the next chapter, to move forward with love, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of hope. And so, John took a deep breath and stepped into the future, knowing that the final turn of his life had led him back to where he had always wanted to be, with his family stronger than ever, ready to embrace whatever came next.